Hi, my name is Matt, as you probably know. Today I'm going to be talking about two of the texts that we've read for class, The Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Late Victorian Holocaust by Mike Davis. So the idea today is that we're going to be using our understanding of Marx and the Communist Manifesto as a kind of looking glass through which to peer at the Late Victorian Holocaust and hopefully kind of glean a better understanding from that. So having read a lot of Marx first for class, going into late Victorian Holocaust, there are a lot of similarities I initially noticed. So in terms of their similarities, both writers shun many of the same ideas, one of which is capitalism. However, both view it a little bit differently. Marx tends to view capitalism as the bane of society, and as a communist that's what he's intently writing against. Whereas with Davis, he writes not entirely openly against capitalism, but against imperialism, which is probably a more radical offshoot of capitalism. That's why I think at initial reading it might be easy to just take the two ideas of Marx and Davis and just kind of push them together as very similar and put them aside and forget about it for later. But I think it's important to know this is where you can really differentiate between the two writers. Marx pictures a government that is constructed by the poor, for the poor, and constructed of one single economic and social class. Davis, however, writes not necessarily in favor of one form of government, as you can see in the evidence he provides, but rather he makes a point to praise those that do an excellent job in protecting the weakest members of his society. And it's apparent that because Marx writes with a much more extremist voice in his text, that the Communist Manifesto ends up becoming a lot more polarizing than it could be. And even though we find that it has been heavily influential in the development of the modern world, we find that it failed to really produce the lasting change that Marx so desired because of its very polarizing voice. And though we find that Davis's opinion is very strong and heavily present in the text, he does a much better job of tempering it and marketing it to a much wider audience. Ideally, this is why the late Victorian Holocaust calls for a much more realistic change, one that can be brought about, one that can last a lot longer. So what our attention is initially drawn to in a late Victorian Holocaust is found in the introduction, or what Mike Davis calls a note on definitions. So in the book, between pages 17 through 22, Mike Davis points out several vocab words under the pretense of defining them for us before we go into the book, hoping that we can better understand them. However, what he does here is rather crafty. He organizes his vocab words in such a way that he leads us to his thesis. Finishing this section with the word Holocaust is akin to a very bold period, giving the reader some idea of exactly how devastating these droughts were in the late Victorian period. And in this section, Davis makes it abundantly clear how pervasive he believes his opinion will be in the following text. He writes, "The contemporary photographs used in this book are thus intended as accusations, not illustrations." From what he says in the introduction, we might gather that Mike Davis is about to go on a very opinionated kind of tirade. Yet that's not really what he does. Instead, he chooses to gather and provide us with evidence, telling us exactly why we should agree with him. If you compare this to the writings of Marx, while philosophically and intellectually brilliant, it is just that. Philosophy. Marx struggles to provide any real-world evidence to substantiate the claims that he makes in his book. Furthermore, the claims that Davis makes are not only supported, but very well supported by the evidence he provides, and he makes them easily believable by tempering them, not making them too extremely radical. This is very well demonstrated in the examples Davis provides regarding the Indian and the Chinese empires. In these examples, Davis wants to draw the distinction that these governments, the Indian and Chinese governments, are ones that exist to support their weakest, the lowest citizens, so to speak. He points out that the Indian government at the time, though it may not have been the most organized government, or even the most equitable, did a very solid job in responding to the needs of its lowest citizens, the hungriest, the poorest. Similarly, in the chapter China, Mandates Revoked, Davis draws attention to the Qing dynasty. He once again points out that this government does an ideal job of responding to its citizens' needs in a time of drought or famine. Of note, though, it is apparent that Davis does not wish to laud these governments as being the most ideal governments, but rather as having perhaps the best responses to its citizens' needs. Ultimately, I think this is where we see the greatest distinction. Whereas Marx attempted to propose a new form of government, new ideas, essentially a new picture of the world, Davis solely wishes to challenge the existing systemic issues with the world right now. And ultimately, it makes his argument much more palatable and realistic.